Hello. Could there have been a better lead-in for my talk than Anthony Weiner, man? Well done. So Donglegate happened. I am not here to talk about Donglegate. I'm not going to even explain Donglegate to you if you don't know what it is. You seem like a crowd that knows how to use the internet. I'm actually not even here to talk to you about Facebook and how we convince them to take violence against women as hate speech on their pages more seriously. What I am here to talk to you about is the problem, the issue at the heart of all of these eruptions, as we called them, I like that, which is the woman problem. You know, the problem where in tech and political spaces, there aren't very many women. And a lot of the women in those spaces say, it's a really tough and hostile place to be. And since this is solve for X, I'm going to solve that equation for you, and I'm going to give you a spoiler right up front. The solution to the woman problem is to start treating women like a solution, right? So I am not going to make a moral argument for diversity here. Usually when we talk about diversity and inclusion, it winds up being like talking to you about eating your Brussels sprouts, right? You know that they're good for you, you know you should, which kind of makes you not want to do it. Now for me, I actually love Brussels sprouts, so it would have to be peas, but I'm not here to talk to you about eating your peas either. Either you've already been convinced by those moral arguments, in which case you can take this whole talk as ammunition, a frame that you can take into convincing other people, or you're not gonna be. I'm here to talk to you about taking diversity seriously, taking the meaningful inclusion of women, of people of color, of trans people, people who are typically marginalized from tech and political spaces, taking that inclusion seriously, how that can make your project, your company, your community awesome enough to produce something like Brosie the Riveter. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, so this is just a little tease. First, we have to talk about something called stereotype threat. So stereotype threat works something like this. A group of researchers took a group of subjects, both men and women, and asked them to individually go into a dressing room and try on an article of clothing. Half of them tried on a sweater. The other half tried on a swimsuit. When each individual subject was in the dressing room with their article of clothing on, they were asked to take a math test. Guess what happened? The men didn't matter what they were wearing. The women wearing the swimsuits performed significantly worse than the women wearing the sweaters. That is how the stereotype threat functions. All it takes is the most minor cue, and people get stressed out enough to live up to the stereotypes we have of them. It works in the political arena. I don't know how many of you saw that fluff piece in the Times about, oh my goodness, who carries the purses of powerful women politicians, right? Harmless fluff piece, we wish. Name It, Change It actually did research and found that the more media covers the appearance of politicians, female politicians, and this includes clothing and accessories, the fewer votes they get, the less likely they are to be elected. Even positive or neutral coverage of appearance is enough to cue voters to remind them that we're supposed to think of females as ornamental, and women lose elections this way. Stereotype threat also doesn't just apply to women. If you remind a group of African American students about the stereotype, which we know is false, that African Americans have below average intelligence, those students are going to do worse on their SATs than they would otherwise, right? So this is pervasive. But again, I'm not here to tell you this because I'm making a moral argument. I want to tell you how this can make you, your project, your community, whatever it is you want to do in the world, make you more effective by working to combat this. So let's start with some simple math because I'm a lady after all. Let's assume that your project or space or community has 10 people in it, right? And let's assume that right now you're at 20% representation of women. That's the big threshold we just crossed in the Senate, woo, right? And let's assume that you're not making any efforts to combat stereotype threat or make it an actively more welcoming place for those women to work. This is probably the situation you're in right now. You've got 8 guys who, on average, on the whole, are working up to their potential because everyone expects them to. And you've got 2 women who probably are very extraordinary to even have gotten in the door in the first place, right, to be those 2 women. And they're working in an environment that is toxic to them and that's making them unable to do what they're actually capable of doing, right? So who wants this to be the situation? You are working, whatever you're doing it with the brakes on. If you do the work, if you make the investment to combat stereotype threat, to make your workplace a place that's genuinely welcoming and productive for women, you instantly get a productivity and creativity boost, right? I don't have to explain that to you. So automatically you are winning, but this is underselling it, right? Because also, once your workplace or your community becomes a place where women feel comfortable and like they can really do their best and contribute, you expand your talent pool, right? You suddenly have a much bigger talent pool to draw from, and we all know what happens when you have a bigger talent pool, right? You get people with greater skills, your project does better, we all change the world, right? This is crucial stuff. But it's not even that the women who are already in your space are gonna do better work. It's not even that you have a bigger talent pool. I want to argue that focusing on diversity, doing the hard, sometimes difficult work of really making a workplace where everyone feels welcome and everyone is able to do their best from whatever background they're at, fundamentally changes the type of work we can achieve. It is really easy to have a homogeneous workplace, right? And I want to say that up front. It does not require any nefarious intent, right? Most of us are kind of narcissistic people. And if left to our own devices, if we don't do anything intentional, when we hire, we look for people we like, people we want to work with. And who do we like? We tend to like people who kind of remind us of us, right? So if we're not careful, we are going to do like, you know, Y Combinator does and look for people who are the right kind of nerdy. Not to single them out, but you know, that's exactly how that happens. And we're gonna be the ones defining what that is. The problem in a homogeneous workplace is that it's like a jigsaw puzzle. Everyone already knows what their role is. There's really a limited number of things. It might be a beautiful, wonderful jigsaw puzzle, but it's really only a limited number of outcomes you can get. If you pay attention to diversity, you can be building with Legos, right? And you are exponentially increasing the kinds of outcomes you can get from whatever your project is by bringing in people with genuinely different perspectives and backgrounds. Okay, so how do we do this? I'm gonna give you 3 quick tips. There's a lot to say here. First, do no harm, right? So first, do no harm, what does that mean? It means you have to combat stereotype threat. It means you may have to do like PyCon did really well and have a policy and enforce a policy, for example, that sexualized conversation and content is not welcome in your space, right? You have to figure out what is keeping the people who feel outside, feeling outside, and actively take steps to combat that. That includes, number 2, stop with the tokenism, right? This is not a checkbox. This is not about collecting one of each action figure. And this gets to stereotype threat too, right? Because another great study showed it had women take a test, and they were either in a room with 2 women or 2 men. No priming, no reminding of any particular stereotype. The women taking the test with other women in the room did better than the women taking a test with only men in the room, right? Tokenism, you are going to fail. And remember, the mission here is to do better at your project. This is not a moral argument. You have to bring in a lot of friends for your tokens, okay? Your tokens need company. And then finally, once you've got this all in place and you've got people coming in, you're doing great hiring. Oh, by the way, if you don't know where to hire, you should ask. Don't wait for people to give you binders, right? So, and if you don't know, ask someone until you get to someone. You now know, all of you, someone who can help you find great women to hire. I know a ton of badass women in tech and politics, and if I don't know the right person, I know someone who knows the right person. So your excuses are now gone. You have to look. You have to also sometimes do what PDF does and other great organizations, where if people send them all male panels, they send them back and they say, sorry, try again. You have to be really intentional and active about this. And then once you're doing all of these, you have to get over yourself, okay? Because what's gonna happen once you bring in all this wonderful diversity so that you can get ahead is those people are gonna bring you new approaches and new ideas and new ways of doing things that are gonna feel really unfamiliar to you. That's the point, right? That's the whole idea here if we're not making a moral argument, right? And so if you say, sorry, that's not how we do things here, if you're not open to that, you're trying to make a jigsaw puzzle out of Legos, right? So you're completely shooting yourself in the foot. On the other hand, if you open up and you say, oh, okay, well, let's try that, right? You don't have to say that every idea. I'm not saying that, You know, I'm not talking about magical Negroes here, all right? Like, not every idea is gonna be good. But you have to be open to changing the way you do things, because that change is what's going to give your project or your community or your company the edge. If you do all these things right, as I referred to in the beginning, you may, in fact, create a space awesome enough to produce Brosie the Riveter. And I want to close by telling you the story about how Brosie came into being. I got this story from a website called the Hawkeye Project, which is a great site to check out. And it comes from a woman who works for a gaming company. She didn't use her name, so I don't have it to share with you. She works for a company that is doing a lot of things right. These are her words, right? She has great gender equity. She's not a token. She feels really comfortable and supported in her space as a woman, with one exception. Her boss is madly in love with a giant stereotype threat and has this giant poster hung up where everyone can see it all day long. Oops, sorry. Back. All day long, it makes her crazy. She is stewing. Think about all the creative and awesome things she could be doing for that company instead of stewing, right? So finally, she's had enough, and because a lot of things are already going right in this space, she feels supported enough to speak out to one of her colleagues and be like, I have had it, right? And he's like, you are totally right. Again, this is an example of lots of things going right, and together, they design Brosie, right? And they blow him up to the same size as the original poster, and they frame him, and they swap him out for the original poster in their boss's office, and they wait for their boss to come in. And they sweat, and they're like, oh my God. But this is a really cool creative risk. This is a creative solution to a problem. This is things going right, because you are never going to do it all right all the time, right? The fact that this boss has a blind spot is not a sign of failure, right? Because this company has produced a system that can handle a couple of blind spots and empower the people in that community to speak up and address them creatively. That's winning, right? So we shouldn't feel like you have to do it right all the time. So they sweat, and they're like, oh my God, what's going to happen? And finally, they get a response. And the CEO stretches. Right? He takes a deep breath. Who knows what he swore under his breath or what his original response was, but he worked through it, and he says to them, thank you. I totally needed that, and I'm taking you out to lunch. And the story ends with him hanging the two posters side by side as an example and a reminder to everyone in the company. And I am going to end here as an example and a reminder to all of you. Thank you.